Thank you to the organizers for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion and to being with you. I have already learned a lot this morning. Well, as Selma already pointed out, my topic will be whether there's a contradiction between Islam and human rights. And I will start with the Iranian cleric Mohammad Shabestari, who once pointedly stated that actually the question was not whether Islam and human rights were compatible, but whether contemporary Muslims wanted to allow this compatibility to come into being. His point was that there are more than enough theories and approaches that would render Islam and democracy, Islam and equality, Islam and human rights compatible. But to be effective, they need to be applied, put to practical use. Shabestari is himself one of the intellectuals at the forefront of this effort. In the following, I would like to introduce you to his arguments, as well as those of two other thinkers who today influence public debate among Muslims worldwide, but especially among those in the West, where they have either spent significant time as Shabestari or are living now as Abdulkarim Surush and Mohsen Kadivar, whom I will address later, do. They are also all characterized by the way they take up Western influences, theories, and approaches, and integrate them into an Islamic frame of reference by connecting them to Islamic concepts. Sheila Ben Habib referred to this process once as framing. It serves to protect them against charges of Western paternalism or alien influence. In 1968, young Shabestari, born in 1936, accepted an invitation to head the Islamisches Zentrum in Hamburg. Here, Iranian business people had funded the construction of Germany's fourth oldest mosque starting in 1953. The Imam Ali Mosque, a representative building by the Alster River, had always been headed by a cleric trained in Qom, the recognized center of Iranian religious scholarship. Shabestari returned to Iran in 1977 and there finally found the time to read the many authors whose works had piqued his interest during his stay in Germany. Protestant theologians like Paul Tillich and Karl Barth, but also the hermeneutic philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer. He had heard much about them in his Hamburg years, but only now did he engage thoroughly with their ideas. And since he knows German very well, he learned German very well while he was in Germany, he was able to read their books. His reading was above all motivated by the question how Islam was made compatible with democracy and human rights. That is to say, how Islamic tenets could be reconciled with the achievements of modernity. He turned to modern hermeneutics and Christian theology to argue in favor of this compatibility. Shabestari's thoughts center on one idea. An objective reading of texts is impossible. All readers are guided to some extent by the knowledge they bring to their reading. He draws a far-reaching conclusion from this, that no reading of the Quran can claim to be the sole correct one. He largely follows a line of argument drawn from German hermeneuticists, particularly Immanuel Kant. As the study of human understanding, hermeneutics must proceed from the assumption that human capacity for understanding is limited. That is why it must insist on the historical contextualization of all human thought and knowledge. Shabestari applies Kant's thoughts to the Quran, writing, quote, "What was formulated within a specific Western horizon requires a form of translation of its content and recasting of its phrasing to be intelligible within a new horizon." Modern hermeneutics addressed the problem named by Kant and teaches that the meaning of any text is a hidden truth that can only be revealed through interpretation. Only through this process, Shabestari argues, can a text be made to speak. Without interpretation, neither text nor speech can be intelligible. This is where Gadamer comes into play. Shabestari adopts his approach of turning Kant's statement into a positive assumption. Understanding must become an essentially infinite conversation on the interpretation of historical and cultural heritage. He adopts Gadamer's idea that there can be no understanding that is free from all prejudice. Quote Gadamer, however much the will of our intellect must be directed to escaping the constraints of our preconceptions. Though there can be no unprejudiced understanding, the preconceptions themselves must be subject to continuous scrutiny in the process of understanding. A text can only be understood once the reader had grasped the question that it intended to answer. Gadamer stated, and Shabestari embraces this rule. Though he never mentions the Quran by name, it is clear that is what he means when he explains the fifth hermeneutical principle. That is to say that the interpretation of a text becomes more difficult with the number of centuries between its production and its reading. Readers living in a time and with experiences that are radically different from those of the author must translate the text into their own horizon. Shabestari states in carefully general terms. By this, he means that the Quran needs to be contextualized. His explanation that the original position or vantage point of an author needs to be established as the center of a text's meaning, around whose axis the content has been arranged, as Gadamer has put it, is addressed to religious texts in general, but he clearly refers to the Quran. Shabestari aims to understand the historical situation in which the text was created, what the author was trying to let the audience know, what linguistic gifts and abilities were available to him, and under what historical conditions his addressees lived. These questions, closely following Gadamer's approach in understanding language as the medium of hermeneutical experience, can only be answered through thorough historical analysis, Shabestari states. Any other mode would merely have the interpreter impose his own preconceptions on the text. Shabestari further illustrates his contention that objective readings are impossible because all readers have preconceived notions and previous understandings, as well as individual interests with a reference to the history of Islamic theology. He refers to the fundamental views of the Quran espoused by the Asharite and Mu'tazilite schools. Both, Shabestari states, can be argued and are legitimate positions. What both Asharites and Mu'tazilites understood of the Quran was based on their respective preconceptions. Shabestari concludes that there's no such thing as a zehn khali, a term he may be familiar with from the context of Zen Buddhism, and which he translates into Farsi. In Zen Buddhism, the concept of mushin, literally meaning innocence in Japanese, refers to a completely disinterested, intention-free interpretation, unconstrained by the wishes of the ego. This is a state of completely natural thinking, free from dualism, an attitude of radical openness to intuitive emotion that can look at a situation entirely free from individual conceptions. To Shabestari, humans cannot be such blank slates. He argues that preconception and guiding interests are universal features of reading, and therefore a multitude of possible interpretations exist. That is why he sees a legalist Islam centered on the juristic aspects of the faith as only one possible interpretation among many. It cannot be taken for absolute and has no legitimate claim to being one with the will of God. He himself rejects legal Islam, which he distinguishes both from spiritual Islam and traditional quietist Islam. In his opinion, it is incompatible with democracy and human rights in its intent to enforce Quranic penal law and an allegedly Quranic interpretation of human rights. But Shabestari sees not Islamic law, but Iman, faith, as central to religion. Accordingly, he does not see adherence to legal norms as central to an Islamic life, but the inner spiritual attitude. True faith cannot be strengthened by forcing people to follow legalistic rules. He argues instead that the basis of all true faith is freedom of thought and free will. Yet, what must the political system look like in which Muslims can live their faith freely? Shabestari concludes from his Quranic hermeneutics that the Quran itself contains very few instructions for political rule. It merely demands that government must be just, no more than that. There are no practical details as to how the system must be set up. He buttresses this claim by pointing to the fact that Ali ibn Abi Talib, the fourth caliph, charged his governor of Egypt solely with ruling justly and respecting the traditions of all people in the newly conquered land. This is a reference to the famous letter of Ali to Malik al-Ashtar. The content supports Shabestari's view that government must above all be just. There is no reference to institutions of government or the necessity of applying Islamic law that, for example, Khomeini argued for. To Shabestari, that makes it entirely compatible with human rights. Since the Quran itself suggests no concrete system, Shabestari argues that the people are free to choose what society they wish to live in and how to best realize their faith. He proposes a democratic system that allows full freedom to its citizens because faith is not an ideology. Such a system would allow the people to best realize human rights in practice and would thus be the best for people's faith. The next person I would like to introduce you to is Abdul Karim Soroush, who was born in 1945, one of the world's leading Muslim intellectuals today. Soroush applied Western methods in his research, studying as well as Shabestari, the variety of Quranic interpretation, but from an epistemological perspective. One central explanation he adopted was drawn directly from Western philosophy of science. Soroush was one of the main ideologues of the Iranian regime for some time. His critique of the ruling clergy and its claim to exclusivity in religious interpretation caused his fall from grace in 1996. He was first attacked in the media, then targeted with death threats and physically assaulted, especially in response to his article, Freedom and the Clergy. In it, Soroush argued that public funding had turned the clergy into a social interest group, claiming a monopoly to defend its privilege. And this claim to exclusive insight led to the ossification of religious thinking. He writes, "Any group that sees itself as the bearer of the sole valid interpretation of religion and seeks to base political power and material advantage on this claim must be rejected." That was heavy stuff in a theocratic state. And this is why for the past 25 years, he has been living in permanent exile. His academic work took him to such highly reputed institutions as the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, to Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. The central tenet of Soroush's position is that religious knowledge is mutable. As all human insight changes depending on the time and the state of science, so must human knowledge of religion. Over time, new interpretations of faith emerge, appropriate to the conditions under which the interpreters themselves live. Soroush's epistemological stance is thus that it is possible to infinitely increase understanding, but any such increase will only ever approach closer to its object. Mere humans can never truly know what God expects of them. They can never understand what divine law really is or what it intends. God's intentions are unfathomable, and all assumed knowledge of them, Soroush claims, echoing Karl Popper, is mere presumption. Epistemology teaches him that human understanding of the Quran can never fully encompass identical the text itself and its true intent. Humans can only hope to recognize God's ultimate goal, and the goal of religion can never be in contradiction with humanity. The text of the Quran, like all texts, is open and invites interpretation. Over time, Soroush argues new interpretations of faith arise that are adapted to the circumstances in which its interpreters live. Soroush does not see this as a novel insight. Quite the contrary, he argues that the prevalent rigid interpretation of Islam is a recent phenomenon. Past scholars had always assumed that interpretation was changeable. In defense of this stance, Soroush cites the concept of ijtihad and the multiplicity of historical interpretations of the Quran recorded. The fact that exegetes could arrive at so many different readings further proves, he claims, that there is a fundamental difference between the human understanding of religion and religion as such. Thus, Soroush differentiates between religion and religious understanding. He sees religious understanding as based on religion, but not identical with it. This allows a scope for reinterpretation. The obvious differences between the religion and religious understanding, he argues, clearly prove the need to make such a distinction. One example he cites is that religion, at least in the view of the religious, is free from contradictions, while religious understanding, that is to say, the interpretation of religious texts by scholars, frequently contains contradictions, regardless of whether it is in the field of jurisprudence, theology, or exegesis. Soroush sees this differentiation between religion and religious understanding as a key formula to separate the changeable from the environt, the holy from the mundane elements of religion. He also sees it as a point from which a revitalization of religious thought can be undertaken. All other approaches of modern interpretation are rejected. And since, according to Soroush, the Quran is open to interpretation, it can be interpreted in a way that does not contradict the tenets of democracy and human rights. This attitude was bound to cause him problems, of course, in Iran, where the position of Khomeini still dominates public discourse. In the view of the Islamic Republic's founder, rights belonged solely to God. Humans had no rights as such, only duties towards God. It is possible for God or his deputy on earth, the Wali Fari, to grant humans certain rights, but since these are not naturally inherent, they can be revoked as God or his representative may choose. According to Khomeini, all humans must subject their needs to the good of the public, the Ummah, and can therefore not claim any individual liberties before the government. The Western concept of universal human rights was countered in Iran with the argument that Muslims, owing to historical and social developments specific to their culture, wished to honor the rights of God before those of men. Soroush's stance on human rights has left this relativistic position of the leading clergy far behind. Neither is he interested in arguing that Islam is compatible with human rights, or indeed that the idea of human rights stems from Islam, as some Muslim apologetics claim until today. To him, human rights are simply the dictate of human reason. It is thus ipso facto impossible for them to contradict religion, because God's will cannot be against reason. The fact that they originated in a context outside of religion does not stop Soroush from considering their realization in an Islamic system possible and indeed necessary. The rights of God would remain inviolate and human and divine values come to full agreement. His position here is one rarely seen outside secularist circles. Like them, he assumes that human rights that derive from outside the sphere of religion, he assumes that humans have rights that derive from outside the sphere of religion solely on the strength of being human. Unlike the secularists, though, he argues for this position from a religious stance. If Soroush's argument were to be followed to its logical conclusion, a number of laws in Islamic jurisprudence could no longer be applied, laws that are actually applied today in Iran. This especially concerns the class of had penalties, punishments for transgressions, that include the amputations of hands or stoning to death. Soroush argues that it is not necessary to follow Islamic law in detail. He distinguishes between values of a primary and secondary degree. Secondary values concern details of religious law, such as dress codes, and thus differ from religion to religion. All religions, as well as human reason, though, are in full agreement on the significance of primary values, such as justice and human dignity. Based on this premise, Soroush seeks to develop a blueprint for a political system that is both Islamic and democratic. This effort leads him to a second central idea, a religious democratic government. It is precisely because he cares passionately about faith that this experiences with the reality of Islamism made him a supporter of separating religion and state. Abuses of power, censorship, oppression, corruption, and nepotism cause more and more people in Iran to turn away from Islam. And this is why Soroush argues for democracy as a solution, since it is the system of government best suited to protect religion, that is to say, the rights of God. It protects religion from being perverted away from God's will by its purported spokesman. Where human rights are respected, he argues, religion is safe from such abuse. That is why Soroush sees the ideal form of government as democratic as well as religious. Soroush, therefore, no longer bothers with interpreting individual passages of the Quran in political terms. His perspective sees the will of the Creator as a whole. This distinguishes him at a fundamental level from many scholars trying to demonstrate the tolerance Islam has historically shown to other religions, for example. Their work often glosses over assaults on people of other faith or emphasizes their rarity and their political rather than religious motivation. In Soroush's argument, such interpretations are absolutely irrelevant. He seeks to adapt his understanding of religion to the modern conception of human rights, not the reverse. This puts him ahead of everyone trying to claim universal rights as an Islamic value from the Quran and Sunnah. To Soroush, human rights are not religious, but acceptable to any truly religious person, aside from being obviously necessary. The only consistent political system to Soroush is a democracy that realizes human rights. As it most easily accommodates a liberal economic system, it is also best suited to support religiosity in the long run, since, quote, a hungry stomach knows no religion, unquote. Religious duties of government in Soroush's ideal state thus also include meeting the people's material needs. It is through this that religious democracy deserves its appellation. It is religious as a system because it enables the faithful to lead a religious life. This leads Soroush to the conclusion that a religious democratic government is actually more religious than a government of Islamic law. He contrasts a so-called hukumati dini and a hukumati fiqhi. The latter, the government of Islamic law, only enforces the principle of Sharia or Islamic law in society. Soroush doubts that a society that only applies Sharia law can be truly religious in the intent of the creator. Enforcing Islamic law does not create a truly religious society, but only one living according to Islamic law. Appearances, though, do not necessarily indicate the true inner state of a community. Christians, too, he argues, could theoretically introduce Islamic law. They might take a liking to headscarves, agree to ban alcohol, or conclude that cutting off hands was an effective deterrent to robbery. None of this would make them Muslims. To Soroush, the intent underlying a pious act is more important than formal adherence to Islamic law. Intent, though, cannot be forced externally. Quote, bigotry and dishonesty, not drinking and gambling, are the greatest sins. Yet the legalistic view values public acts more than the cultivation of virtue in the heart. It follows that there is no specific form that a religious government must take. Its form changes with the historical era. Thus, Soroush claims that God has not decreed any one form of government, but that any government that realizes the goals of true religion is ipso facto religious government. Thus, there is no formal criterion to distinguish his vision of a religious democratic government from any other democracy. Quote, indeed, one should not expect a religious government to be different from a non-religious one in its structure. After all, it is not the case that reasonable people walk on two legs and religious ones on their heads. How is it a bad thing that other nations and societies have also embraced the same methods that our definition of religious government has led us to? There is a third intellectual I wanted to introduce to you, Mohsen Kadivar, who holds the clerical rank of a mujtahid, but has been living in the United States for 15 years now. But I'm running out of time, so I will shorten this. He is, his main argument is that there are two different kinds of Islam. There is one traditional Islam and the reformist Islam. He gives the characteristics of those two Islams and shows that one is propagated by the Al-Azhar or Qom or the clerical ranks in Qom and Najaf, and the other one is that sort of Islam that has been put forward by the so-called religious enlightenment or people who argue for progressive Islam or reformist Islam. And what the result of his thinking also is, and he puts it in those words, he writes, Islam is as clean and pure as rainwater, and in flowing through different places and times, it has taken on different colors, flavors, and traditions. And if people so wish, it can take on the color of human rights today. So this is where Kadivar, in his line of argumentation, is in complete agreement with Shabestari. It is actually the Muslims who decide. The question is not what Islam fundamentally is. Anything can be justified from or read into the Quran. We already had that in the discussion before. depending, as Shabestari would put it, what your preconceptions or your interests are. When you read the Quran, you can find democracy, you can find equality, you can find human rights in it, but you can of course also find patriarchy, socialism, or theocracy in the Quran. It's just the people who decide what they want to find and what they want to put into practice. And let me quote in the end the fourth caliph, or the first Imam, Ali, who once said, "The Quran is no more than writing between two covers. It does not speak. It is humans who speak to it." And I believe this is exactly what Shabestari, Kadivar, and Sarouche want to say, that is us Muslims to decide what we do and whether we want to embrace human rights or not. Thank you very much for your attention.